The evening sun cast a pale orange glow over the narrow suburban lane where Evelyn's house stood. A small, weathered structure tucked at the very end. The walls, once painted a cheerful white, now bore the marks of time, with patches of peeling paint revealing the gray cement underneath. Vines crawled lazily up the side of the house, and the wooden shutters creaked softly in the evening breeze. Inside, the house was quiet, too quiet, as if the walls themselves had grown used to silence. Evelyn sat by the window, her silhouette framed by the dim light of a single lamp. Her hands, gnarled from years of work, rested on her lap, fingers gently fidgeting with the corner of a worn scarf. Her eyes, though slightly clouded with age, gazed out at the empty street with a mixture of longing and weariness. She wasn't waiting for anyone in particular. It had been years since anyone visited regularly. Instead, she watched the world pass by, an observer in a life that seemed to have quietly moved on without her. The only person who still shared this small, forgotten corner of the world with her was her son, Nathan. Nathan was in the kitchen, clinking dishes together as he half-heartedly washed the few remnants of their modest dinner. His shoulders were slouched, his movements slow and methodical. He had always been like this, quiet, reserved, as though carrying an invisible weight on his back. Nathan wasn't what most people would call successful. In fact, among the residents of the lane, he was often the subject of pity or scorn. That Nathan, always wandering around like he's lost. Mrs. Turner, their neighbor, had remarked just the other day while chatting with another resident. Poor Evelyn, working her whole life just to end up with a son like that. The words, like so many others over the years, carried on the wind and found their way into Evelyn's ears. She never responded, never defended Nathan aloud. What would be the point? People saw what they wanted to see. A middle-aged man who had drifted from one odd job to the next. Unable to hold down steady work, living in his mother's house as if stuck in the past. But Evelyn knew her son better than anyone else. She knew the gentle way he would tend to stray cats that wandered into their yard. The patience with which he fixed small, broken appliances around the house. She knew the quiet sadness in his eyes that spoke of dreams unfulfilled, of potential unrecognized. To her, Nathan wasn't useless, he was simply lost. Don't listen to them, Nathan, Evelyn would often say when she saw the flicker of doubt cross his face after an encounter with a particularly judgmental neighbor. They don't know you like I do. You're more than their words. You'll find your way one day. Nathan would nod, offering a faint smile, but the words rarely stuck. He had heard the whispers for so long that they had become his own inner voice. From the time he was a boy, Nathan had always been different. While other children were outside playing ball or riding bikes, he would sit under the large oak tree in their backyard, sketching or reading. His teachers had labeled him unfocused because he struggled to keep up with subjects that didn't interest him. His peers, crueler in their assessments, called him weird or lazy. At family gatherings, his relatives would shake their heads, their voices dripping with disappointment. What will become of him? Evelyn, he'll never make it in the real world if he doesn't toughen up. Her brother had said once, loud enough for Nathan to overhear. Evelyn had clenched her fists under the table but had said nothing. She didn't need to. She knew her son felt the sting of those words more deeply than anyone could imagine. As Nathan grew older, the expectations of society weighed heavier on him. He tried to fit the mold, enrolling in college courses he didn't care for, taking jobs that drained him of energy and spirit. Each failure felt like confirmation of what everyone already seemed to believe. With every passing year, he retreated further into himself, until he became a shadow of the boy who used to dream under the oak tree. But Evelyn never lost faith. She worked long hours at the local bakery, kneading dough until her hands ached, just to keep the house running. Every evening, she would return home, setting down a small loaf of bread or a box of pastries on the kitchen counter for Nathan. "Eat something, dear," she'd say with a smile, even on the days when exhaustion clung to her like a second skin. Nathan would mumble his thanks, avoiding her eyes. He often felt like a failure in her presence, though she never once made him feel that way. If anything, her unwavering support only deepened his guilt. What had he done to deserve it? Nothing, he would think. He had done nothing but disappoint her. The days in their small house followed a predictable rhythm. Evelyn would wake before dawn, quietly preparing to leave for the bakery. Nathan would wake later, his footsteps slow and deliberate as he made his way to the kitchen for breakfast. They would exchange a few words, sometimes a smile, before Evelyn left. Then the house would fall silent again, save for the hum of the refrigerator or the occasional creak of the floorboards. Nathan spent most of his days wandering. He'd walk through the nearby park, sit by the pond, and watch ducks glide across the water. Sometimes he'd bring a sketchbook and draw, though he rarely finished anything. He wanted to be productive, to do something meaningful, but he didn't know where to begin. The weight of expectations, his own, his mother's, and society's, left him paralyzed. One evening, as the sun dipped lower in the sky, Evelyn called Nathan into the living room. She was sitting in her usual spot by the window, her knitting needles clicking softly as she worked on a scarf. "Nathan, come sit with me for a moment," she said, her voice gentle but firm. He hesitated, then complied, lowering himself into the armchair opposite her. She set her knitting aside and looked at him, her gaze steady. "You know I love you, don't you?" she began. He nodded, his eyes fixed on the frayed edge of the rug beneath his feet. "I've never cared what others say about you," she continued, "but I care what you say about yourself. You're not a failure, Nathan. You're my son, and that means you're capable of so much more than you think." Her words hung in the air, heavy with emotion. Nathan felt a lump rise in his throat, but he swallowed it down, unwilling to let her see how deeply her words affected him. He wanted to believe her, to hold on to the hope she offered, but the voice in his head, the one shaped by years of doubt and ridicule, refused to let him. "Thanks, Mom," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. Evelyn reached across the small coffee table and placed her hand over his. It was a simple gesture, but it carried a weight of love and reassurance that words could never fully convey. As the evening gave way to night, Nathan sat alone in his room, staring at the blank page of his sketchbook. Evelyn's words replayed in his mind, battling against the doubts that had taken root there. For the first time in a long time, he wondered if she might be right. Maybe, just maybe, he wasn't as lost as he thought. The next morning, the light filtered through the thin curtains in Nathan's room, painting soft stripes across the walls. He had barely slept. His mother's words from the night before lingered in his mind. A quiet hum of hope mingled with the sharp sting of doubt. He stared at the ceiling, the blank page of his sketchbook still sitting on the desk beside him, untouched. Evelyn's morning routine was as predictable as the sunrise. By the time Nathan shuffled into the kitchen, she was already dressed in her neatly pressed blouse, her hair tied back in a simple bun. The smell of coffee and freshly toasted bread filled the small room. "Good morning, Nathan," she greeted with her usual warmth, placing a plate of toast on the table. Her hands worked quickly, wrapping up a small sandwich to take with her to work. Despite her age, there was a grace in her movements, a practiced efficiency that came from years of tireless dedication. "Morning," Nathan mumbled, sinking into the chair. He stared at the plate in front of him, the golden edges of the toast almost too perfect, as though mocking his own imperfections. Evelyn glanced at him as she finished packing her bag. "I'll be home by 6, she said, her voice light but firm. "Why don't you take a walk today? Get some fresh air. It'll help clear your mind." Nathan nodded absent-mindedly. He didn't have the heart to tell her that walking was the only thing he ever did these days. Still, he forced a small smile as she kissed his forehead and headed out the door. The sound of her footsteps on the gravel faded into the distance, leaving behind a silence that felt heavier than usual. Nathan stared out the window, the streets slowly coming to life with the morning rush. A delivery truck rumbled by, followed by a couple of kids riding their bikes, their laughter ringing in the air. He felt a pang of envy. a longing for the simplicity of childhood when the weight of expectations hadn't yet settled on his shoulders. After finishing his breakfast, Nathan grabbed his sketchbook and set out. Just as his mother had suggested. The park was quiet at this hour. The paths still damp from the morning dew. He found his usual bench by the pond, a secluded spot shaded by an old oak tree. Ducks paddled lazily across the water, their ripples breaking the mirror-like surface. It was a scene he had sketched 100 times before, yet today it felt different. He opened the sketchbook, flipping past the half-finished drawings of birds, trees, and the occasional portrait of his mother. Each incomplete piece seemed to echo his own fragmented sense of purpose. With a deep breath, he turned to a fresh page and pressed his pencil to the paper. For the first time in weeks, his hand began to move. At first, the lines were hesitant, shaky, as though his doubts had seeped into his very muscles. But as the minutes passed, a rhythm emerged. He sketched the curve of the pond, the arch of the tree's branches, the reflection of the sky on the water. It wasn't perfect, far from it, but it was a start. "Nice work," a voice said, startling him. Nathan looked up to see an older man standing a few feet away. He wore a weathered hat and carried a small easel under one arm. His smile was kind, his eyes twinkling with genuine interest. "Oh, thanks," Nathan muttered, closing the sketchbook instinctively. He wasn't used to compliments, especially from strangers. The man chuckled, setting down his easel a few paces away. "Don't hide it, you've got talent. Mind if I paint here?" Nathan shook his head, unsure of what to say. He watched as the man set up his easel and began unpacking his supplies. There was something calming about the way he moved, as though he belonged to the landscape itself. "You come here often?" the man asked as he dabbed his brush into a palette of earthy tones. "Yeah, almost every day," Nathan admitted. "Good spot, peaceful." The man paused, glancing at Nathan's sketchbook. "You ever thought about doing more with your art?" Nathan hesitated. The question hung in the air, heavy with implications. "I don't think I'm good enough," he admitted finally, his voice barely above a whisper. The man nodded thoughtfully, as though he'd expected the answer. "That's the thing about art, or life. Really, you never feel ready, but you do it anyway." He smiled again, his brush moving effortlessly across the canvas. "Name's Peter, by the way." "Nathan," he replied, feeling a small flicker of warmth at the man's easy demeanor. For the next hour, the two worked in companionable silence. Peter painted the pond, capturing the light and shadow in bold, confident strokes. Nathan sketched quietly, his lines growing steadier as he lost himself in the process. There was no judgment, no pressure, just the simple act of creation. When Peter finally packed up, he turned to Nathan with a parting smile. "Keep drawing, Nathan. The world's got enough critics. What it needs is people who see it differently." Nathan watched him leave, the words resonating in a way he hadn't expected. As he looked down at his sketchbook, he felt a small, unfamiliar spark, a sense of possibility. Maybe his mother was right. Maybe there was more to him than he'd allowed himself to believe. That evening, as Evelyn returned home, she found Nathan at the kitchen table, his sketchbook open in front of him. He was sketching, a bird this time, its wings outstretched as though ready to take flight. She paused in the doorway, her heart swelling with quiet pride. "How was your walk?" she asked, setting down her bag. Nathan looked up, his expression lighter than it had been in years. "It was good," he said simply, and for once, he meant it. Evelyn smiled, placing a hand on his shoulder. "I told you, you'll find your way." Nathan didn't reply, but as he turned back to his drawing, a small, determined smile played on his lips. For the first time in a long while, he felt like he just might. The days that followed brought a quiet shift to Nathan's routine. He began sketching more, his lines no longer hesitant but purposeful. His walks to the park turned into sessions of creative exploration, and he often returned home with pages filled with drawings, some landscapes, others abstract shapes and ideas. Evelyn noticed the change in him. Though she didn't press, she simply watched. her heart swelling with hope and pride. One evening, as Nathan sat at the kitchen table, lost in his sketches, Evelyn placed a steaming cup of tea beside him. "You've been working hard lately," she said, her voice warm. Nathan looked up, a small smile tugging at his lips. "It feels good," he admitted. "For once, it feels like I'm doing something that matters." Evelyn nodded, her own smile soft but knowing. "It always mattered, Nathan. You just needed to see it for yourself." Her words stayed with him long after she'd gone to bed. That night, as he sat alone in the dimly lit kitchen, Nathan picked up one of his sketches, a bold drawing of the old oak tree by the pond. The details were intricate, every line imbued with care and intention. He stared at it for a long time, then made a decision. The next morning, while Evelyn was at the bakery, Nathan took a deep breath and walked into the small community art center downtown. The receptionist, a kind woman with silver-streaked hair, greeted him with a smile. "How can I help you?" she asked. I'd like to show some of my work," Nathan said, his voice trembling slightly. He pulled a folder from his bag, holding it out like a fragile offering. The woman flipped through his sketches, her expression shifting from polite interest to genuine admiration. "These are lovely," she said. "We're hosting a local showcase next month. Would you like to participate?" Nathan's heart raced. For a moment, he considered saying no, retreating back into the safety of obscurity. But then he remembered his mother's words, Peter's encouragement, and the quiet pride he'd felt as his pencil moved across the paper. "Yes," he said finally, "I'd love to." The weeks leading up to the showcase were a whirlwind of preparation. Nathan worked tirelessly, refining his pieces and framing them with Evelyn's gentle encouragement. On the day of the event, she stood beside him in the gallery, her hands clasped tightly as she took in the sight of her son's work displayed under soft, glowing lights. Visitors moved through the space, pausing to admire Nathan's sketches. They commented on the depth of his lines, the way his art seemed to capture not just images but emotions. Nathan stood quietly to the side, his heart pounding with a mix of pride and disbelief. At one point, a man approached him, a gallery owner from a neighboring town. "Your work is remarkable," he said, handing Nathan his card. "If you're interested, we'd love to feature you in one of our exhibits." Nathan accepted the card with shaking hands. As he looked at Evelyn, who was watching from across the room, he saw her eyes glisten with tears. He knew this wasn't just his victory, it was theirs. Later that night, as they walked home under the cool glow of the streetlights, Nathan spoke. "Mom," he said, his voice steady but soft. "Thank you." Evelyn glanced at him, her expression curious. "For what?" "For believing in me," he said, "for seeing something in me when I couldn't see it myself." Evelyn smiled, reaching out to squeeze his hand. "You've always had it, Nathan. I just held the mirror." They walked the rest of the way in silence. But it wasn't the heavy, strained silence of before. It was filled with understanding, with the quiet knowledge that they had weathered something profound together. Months turned into years, and Nathan's art began to gain recognition beyond the small community. He started teaching workshops, sharing his journey with others who felt lost or unseen. His story, once one of doubt and despair, became one of hope and transformation. Evelyn, now retired, spent her days watching Nathan work in their little home studio. Her health began to wane, but she faced it with the same quiet strength she had always shown. One evening, as she sat by the window, Nathan brought her a framed piece of art, a sketch of her knitting by the lamp. Her hands steady and sure. "I made this for you," he said, placing it in her lap. "You've always been my greatest inspiration." Evelyn's eyes filled with tears as she looked at the drawing. "It's beautiful," she whispered, "just like you, Nathan." She passed away peacefully a few weeks later, leaving behind a legacy of love and resilience that Nathan carried with him every day. Years later, at the opening of his first major solo exhibit in a renowned gallery, Nathan stood before a crowd of admirers. As he thanked them for their support, his eyes drifted to the back of the room, where a woman who looked just like Evelyn stood in his memory, her smile as warm and encouraging as ever. He ended his speech with words that echoed hers, hoping they would resonate with someone who needed him as much as he once had. "Believe in yourself," he said, "even when it feels like no one else does. Sometimes, the person you need to prove wrong isn't the world, it's yourself." As the crowd applauded, Nathan felt a quiet peace settle over him. For the first time in his life, he wasn't chasing approval or trying to escape his past. He was simply Nathan, a man who had found his way.